We are excited to have Mr. George Weigel here with us talking today. And we are very, very thankful for someone who has put in a lot of hard work to make it happen. Someone asked me the other day, how did you guys get George Weigel? That's incredible. How did you make it happen? And I said, we have a Tommy. Tommy Wixon, one of our parishioners, is an amazing, amazing man in my eyes. He is... Good morning. As was said before, my name is Andy Pitts. I'm the Pastoral Coordinator Administrator for the Society of St. Gregory the Great. We are excited to have Mr. George Weigel here with us talking today. And we are very, very thankful for someone who has put in a lot of hard work to make it happen. Someone asked me the other day, how did you guys get George Weigel? That's incredible. How did you make it happen? And I said, we have a Tommy. Tommy Wixon, one of our parishioners, is an amazing, amazing man in my eyes. He is the most friendly, charismatic, and outgoing human being you will ever meet in your life. And when he says it's going to happen, it happens. So Tommy is the person to whom we owe the debt of gratitude for today, for all of his hard work, for coordinating everything from getting Mr. Weigel on board, to securing hotels, to booking travel, to anything, you name it, he has been our man. Tommy, thank you from all of us for everything you've done. So without further ado, I will let you introduce your guest to us today.
For years, as a family historian and genealogist, I've had cause to write many letters. And that was especially true before the age of the internet. So when I read something as inspiring as the biographies of Pope St. John Paul II, I was moved to write the author, our guest. He was kind enough to write back, and one thing led to another. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI created the Ordinariate, as you've heard, with a mission to offer a new door into the church Jesus Christ established. And we wanted to reach out to our community with a speaker who loves the church as much as we. May I give you a few details about our speaker? George Weigel is a distinguished fellow of ethics and a theologian at the Ethics and Public Center for Culture, also considered one of America's leading intellectuals. But he's perhaps best known as the biographer of Pope St. John Paul II. He not only contributes to First Things, if you're familiar with that, I'm sure you are. He also serves on their board. He's an author of more than 20 books. His column, The Catholic Difference, is syndicated in 7 countries to 85 newspapers and magazines, including our own Catholic Week. His BA was earned at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. His MA from St. Michael's College. In addition, he's the recipient of at least 19 honorary doctorates. Other honors include the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia et Pontificia, Poland's Gloria Artis Gold Medal, and Lithuania's Diplomatic Star. He's been married for 35 years. She must be coming up on sainthood. 43. Okay, I'm behind.
Counting 44.
Almost 44. He has 3 children, a pediatrician, an arts educator, and a techie. But the best part, they're all serious Catholics. And he's the proud grandfather of 4.5 grandchildren. May I present George Weigel.
Thank you.
Tommy, and good morning, everyone. Given the state of our culture, to be introduced as one of America's leading intellectuals is somewhat like being introduced as the greatest shortstop in Transylvania. I appreciate the shout-out. Let me begin by asking for your prayers. First of all, for my mother, who would have been 105 years old today. So if you keep Betsy Schmitz-Weigel in your prayers during the day. And then I would ask you to pray for my literally oldest friend in the world, Cardinal George Weigel. What is going on in Australia is what I described in my Catholic press column earlier this week as this generation's Dreyfus case. This is a complete travesty of justice, motored in large part by anti-Catholicism. I spoke to the Cardinal the night before he went to jail. He's in astonishingly good form. Described this period in prison as his Lenten retreat. But let's keep him in prayer in the days and weeks ahead. When Tommy very kindly invited me to come down to Mobile, I asked him what he wanted me to talk about. He said people would like to hear some stories of John Paul II. So let me do that, if I may, with the idea of what might we take from this extraordinary life that would be of reflective purpose to us as we walk through the pilgrimage of Lent over the next 7 weeks. Let me begin those stories with my last supper, so to speak, with the Holy Father on December 15th, 2004. In the course of that evening, actually at the end of that evening, as I went to say goodbye for what I thought might be the last time, but I wasn't sure, I said to him, Holy Father, I promise you that if you don't bury me, I will finish what I began. Witness to Hope, the first volume of my John Paul II biography, only takes the story up to 1999, and I wanted him to know that I would finish the story if, as I say, he didn't bury me. The second volume, The End and the Beginning, came out in 2010, 5 years after his death. And as I went around the country and the world as one language edition of that book after another was published, I discovered something interesting. That book, for those of you who have read it, will know, and those who haven't, and of course will run out and buy it this afternoon, has a kind of weird structure. Because in the interim 5 years between the Pope's death and the publication of this book, I came into possession, through the help of some Polish historians I had come to know, of an extraordinary cache of secret police files from behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. The Polish secret police, the East German Stasi, some Russian KGB stuff, Hungarian secret police, the whole, rogues gallery of materials illustrating the communist war against the Catholic Church in general and against Karol Wojtyła in particular. These things were of such interest as primary source materials that I decided I had to begin this second volume by going back to Wojtyła's war against communism and the communist war against Wojtyła, and then we go forward to the last 5 years of his life, and then there's a big evaluative section, actually based on the testimony I gave as a witness for his beatification cause. So I thought, when I'm out and about talking about this book, that people would be interested in all of this spook stuff. I mean, here's all these, I mean, these are like memos to the super wicked Marcus Wolf, head of the Stasi, that, I never expected to get my hands on. And I thought this is what people would be interested nobody was interested, or very few were interested in this. What people wanted were stories. Pope had been dead for 5 years at that point, and people wanted stories. They wanted stories that would somehow bring him back to life in a way that was a bit more tangible than a book. And it struck me on reflecting upon this that this was the instinct, it's a pious instinct, that led to the medieval lives of the saints. And great books like Jacob Dvoragin's, now I'm blanking on the title of the book, it's a collection of medieval hagiographies. The Golden what? Somebody knows it. Pardon?
Legend, I think.
Gold, yeah, and not legend, it's the Golden something or other. Anyway, senior moment there. So this actually led me to do something I never intended to do. And that is write a memoir, Lessons in Hope, of my unexpected life with John Paul II. This is actually a kind of third panel in my biography of the Pope. If you think of that work as a triptych, a triple-sided icon, Witness to Hope would be the center, the end and the beginning would be one side panel. But this book of memories, which is completely different, it has no endnotes, no footnotes, none of the apparatus that makes the other books such large items. It's storytelling, and I hoped it would help bring this remarkable life alive for others in a more personal way. And the book is built around two things the Pope said to me over the course of 15 years of conversation that I hope will provide material for fruitful reflection during Lent. The first of these came in March 1996. We had just had dinner in the papal apartment. He was walking me out, and he said to me in a almost whimsical tone of voice, speaking of other biographies of him, they tried to understand me from the outside, but I can only be understood from inside. What he meant by that, I think, was that other biographers had simply seen the public personality, but had not really tried to come to grips with the man of faith, the man of intellect, the man of culture, the sportsman, the literary figure, the inside that made the outside possible. And I took that very seriously in writing both Witness to Hope in the End and the Beginning. What are some things from that inside-out view of his life and my experience with him that might be of some relevance for us? There are several. The first, I think, of most importance, is that every great thing that John Paul II accomplished as Bishop of Rome for over a quarter century was the fruit of prayer. This was a very, very intelligent man. This was a very shrewd man. But above all, this was a man of prayer, who prayed his way into his great initiatives. One classic example of this is the bold appointment of the Archbishop of Paris in the middle 1980s. The incumbent had reached 75. It was time for a new archbishop. The Pope was not satisfied with the nominees that were being presented to him, who were rather conventional figures. So he prayed his way into the idea of appointing a very young bishop, then the Bishop of Orleans, Jean-Marie Lustiger, as the Archbishop of Paris. And the nuncio called up Bishop Lustiger and said, the Holy Father is going to appoint you the Archbishop of Paris. Do you accept? And Bishop Lustiger said, no. He said, a man with my background cannot be the Archbishop of Paris. What was that background? Jean-Marie Lustiger, whom I was happy to count a friend for many years, was the son of Polish Jews who had migrated to France in the late 1920s, where he was born. His his mother died in the concentration camp at Auschwitz. His father survived the war. He was hidden with a Catholic family in the south of France, converted to Catholicism, went to the Sorbonne for his undergraduate degree, later entered the seminary, became the chaplain of the Sorbonne, where he was a dynamic leader of a group of young Catholic intellectuals who are now, at my age, in their late 60s, still very prominent figures in France. But he said, look, you cannot appoint the son of Polish Jews the Archbishop of Paris. This just isn't going to work. Pope hears this. Offer is made again. Refusal comes back again. Finally, Monsignor Jewish, the Pope's secretary, goes to Orleans and says to Jean-Marie Lustiger, Monsignor, you are the fruit of the prayer of the Holy Father. You are the fruit of the prayer of the Holy Father. That was the end of the discussion. Lustiger went to Paris and became an extraordinary Archbishop of Paris for over 20-some years. He prayed his way into his decisions. Another example of that, I think, is the creation of World Youth Day. When John Paul II proposed this notion of an international Catholic youth festival built around the Stations of the Cross, confession, adoration, daily Mass, and the Pope, the people around him said, in effect, you're crazy. This is never going to work. These kids live on a different planet. It just isn't going to happen. He prayed his way into that decision based on his own experience as a university chaplain, to be sure. But he prayed his way into that decision. And beginning in 1984, these remarkable gatherings have become one of the great markers in the global rhythm of Catholic life over time, an enormous source of religious vocations and wonderful marriages. He prayed his way into his decisions, and that's something that I think all of us can take into heart and live out in our own lives. The second quality of that inside-out view of John Paul II involved the extraordinary cast of characters, the dramatis personae, Shakespeare would say, that surrounded him and that he deliberately gathered around him. Long before ecumenical theology, as those of you who were once Anglicans know, you began to use the term a mutual exchange of gifts. That's a familiar term in ecumenical theology. John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, Father Karol Wojtyła, was living that. And the best example of that is the young people that he gathered around himself as a university chaplain in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Krakow. In 1948, he came back from his doctoral studies in Rome, and the great Cardinal Adam Stefan Sapieha assigned him to create a new center of campus ministry in Krakow because Sapieha knew that the battle for the future of Poland between the church and communism was a battle for the next generation. Young Father Wojtyła did this retail. He went dorm room to dorm room, apartment to apartment, classroom to classroom, rounding up kids, forming them into a choir, singing actually some of the chants we sang at Mass earlier today. These young people, some of whom are still alive and are very dear friends of mine now, became his closest friends for the rest of his life. So here is this extraordinarily gifted priest, scholar, bishop, pope, who has deliberately surrounded himself with lay people, who were, as one of them put it to me, an experimental field for his ideas, but who also taught him things, and from whom he was happy to learn things. This is really quite extraordinary, I think. If you had talked to any of the popes of the previous 200 years, before 1978, and said, tell me about your life as a young priest, tell me about your vocation, this man would have said, well, I went into an Italian seminary at age 11 or 12, put on my first cassock, emerged at age 23, ordained, taught in a seminary, went into the papal diplomatic service, became a curial figure, blah, 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 blah. When you ask John Paul II, how did you spend the first years of your priesthood, he would basically say, I hung out with kids. I was a university chaplain, and I really think that was the formative experience of his ministerial life. His idea, his heroic notion of the priesthood, his idea of the bishop as the defender of the rights of his people, all of that formed in that experience as a university chaplain in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Krakow. 5 years ago, my son Stephen and I, I teach in Poland every summer. Stephen had come over to do this photography on a book that I was writing as a kind of spiritual guidebook to Krakow for the World Youth Day of 2016. And one of Wojtyła's young couples were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. They happen to be very close friends of mine. They're very distinguished people, I might say. He's a world-class nuclear physicist. She's the former vice dean of the Krakow Academy of Music. Anyway, so they have their 50th wedding anniversary mass in the chapel in Wawel Cathedral, where Karol Wojtyła, then Archbishop Wojtyła, had married them on July 4th, 1964, Good American Day. So people are milling about outside the cathedral, a lot of these older Wojtyła kids, or veteran Wojtyła kids, and they're giving Piotr and Teresa Milewski flowers, which is what Poles do on that occasion. And Stephen and I are standing off to the side. And I explained who these people were and what some of the history was. And I said, you're looking at the beginning of World Youth Day. World Youth Day did not begin in Rome in 1984. World Youth Day began with these people when they were your age. My son was then 25. Here in Krakow. So that openness to a broad range of characters, to a wide dramatis persona, had an enormous impact eventually on the life of the whole church. The third characteristic of the man from inside that may tell us some things about our own lives and how we should be living them is his willingness to push the outside of the envelope, to be a man of constant conversation, and what one of those old Wojtyła kids called his permanent openness. And one of the great stories of that in Lessons in Hope is of a Russian woman whose name was Irina Lvoskaya Alberti. She had been born in Russia shortly before the First World War. Her parents had fled Russia during the Russian Revolution of November 1917, had come to Paris, as many Russian emigres did in those days. She had grown up in France, married an Italian diplomat, hence the surname Alberti, raised 2 sons. Her husband, who was an older man, had died before her, died rather shortly after their sons had grown up. So Irina Alberti is living in Paris, editing a quarterly magazine for Russian emigres, had become a Roman Catholic, and decides with a friend of hers to go to Rome for a week of vacation. This is about 1984. So the 2 ladies go to Rome. The other lady has some connections, so they end up in the first row, the prima fila, as they call it, of the Pope's Wednesday audience. So the Pope gives his talk, everybody cheers, and the Pope works, the line of the prima fila. And Irina Alberti greets him in Russian, and he responds in Russian. They speak for a little bit. He goes on, and then he turns around and says, "The next time you're in Rome, call me and come to lunch." This is on 2 minutes acquaintance. So, Mrs. Alberti goes back to Paris, talks to her spiritual director, and says, "The Pope just told me to call him and come to lunch. How do you do that?" And this guy had a little noose and said, "Well, you call the Vatican switchboard and ask for Monsignor Jevish, and you tell him what the Pope said to you," which, of course, Stanislav knew already because he was right there. So, they have a 2-hour conversation 6 months later, which is then repeated a few months after that. And this woman, who, by the way, had been Alexander Solzhenitsyn's personal assistant and housekeeper in Cavendish, Vermont, after her husband died, becomes John Paul II's personal secret agent in the Soviet Union. It's Gorbachev time, things are beginning to open up a little bit. She can go back without too much concern about security. So she starts, going back every 3-4 months, seeing what's going on. And as she put it to me, very simply, if I found anything interesting, I'd tell him. Go to Rome on the way back to Paris and speak with the Pope. She was the one, by the way, who gave me the fantastic story of Solzhenitsyn's reaction to the election of Wojtyła. Solzhenitsyn, as you remember, was living in Cavendish, Vermont in those days, very small town. And Mrs. Alberti had gone to the local grocery store, kind of general store, to pick up some stuff on October 16, 1978. And she hears the radio announce the election of this Pole whom nobody had ever heard of as Pope. And she came back, runs back to the Solzhenitsyn farm. The great man has heard this himself, and he's going nuts. He says, "This is the most important thing that has happened since the First World War. It's going to change everything." So, the point is that John Paul II's permanent openness, his willingness to trust his instincts about people, put him in contact with someone like Irina Alberti, who then became an extraordinary companion in an intellectual sense with him, and an important source of information for him. That's something we all need to keep in mind. Don't close yourself off to the possibility that God may have somebody interesting for you to meet, and out of that may come something grand. The fourth quality of the Holy Father from inside that I think we all ought to reflect upon this Lent is that he was what I would call a happy warrior. And that was demonstrated in a marvelous way, described in here, at that last dinner on December 15, 2004. I had discovered 10 years before that John Paul II liked big coffee table photo books. You know, buildings, nature, whatever. It got the poet's imagination fired up. And in his bedroom, on a table, there were a whole bunch of these kind of books. And I asked Monsignor Jeevish when he was showing me through the digs, I said, what's all this about? He said, he likes to look at those at night. Okay. So I would always bring the Pope a Christmas present. So I lugged over to Rome. It almost filled my entire suitcase. This enormous book of national parks of the United States. My wife had wrapped the thing up nicely. My children and my son-in-law had everybody sign the Christmas card. So I schlepped this thing up to the papal apartment and carry it into the dinner table and give it to them. Well, Karol Wojtyła was a guy who believed in opening his Christmas presents when he got them. So 10 days before Christmas, you know, he's in fairly tough shape at this point. This is 2 months before the first of the last hospitalizations. So this thing is laboriously opened, and then laboriously opened to the table of contents, and he sees Rocky Mountain National Park outside Denver. So, over we go to Rocky Mountain National Park. He looks at this. He says, Rocky Mountain National Park. Denver. World Youth Day, 1993. Bishops of America said it couldn't be done. I proved them wrong. He could still bring the high fastball at the end. He was a happy warrior. He knew far too much of the sorrow of the world for any one man to bear. This was, of course, 2 years after the extraordinary sorrow of the first outbreak of the abuse crisis, which weighed on him enormously, had taken place. And yet, through all of that, I think he remained a happy warrior. That in part goes back to the first characteristic, that extraordinary prayer life, because he had the capacity to take all of that sorrow to the Lord every morning in that hour of private prayer before his daily Mass. And there's something to be learned from that for all of us. Fifth of the characteristics from inside that I might highlight is what I would call his extraordinary pastor's heart. Again, we're back on December 15th, 2004. My father had died on October 19th, 2004, and John Paul II had sent a telegram to be read at the funeral mass, which was very nice. But this was almost 6 weeks later, actually it was close to 7 weeks later. He was in pretty tough shape himself, and I certainly didn't expect him to remember what had happened in my family 2 months before. Yet when I went in there with that big photo album of national parks in the United States, the first thing he said to me, not good evening, not hi, not how are you, not welcome back, the first thing he said to me that night was, how is your mother doing? You know, pastor's memory and concern. And I think there is a lesson in that, not simply for the pastors present, but for all of us. We're all called to have that kind of compassionate heart that is attuned to the fact that we're not the only one with troubles in this world, and that in reaching out to share the burdens of others, our own become a little lighter. Second set of stories in Lessons in Hope that I think provides some material for Lenten reflection are based on an off-the-cuff statement that the Pope made at the airport in Lisbon on May 13th, 1982. That was, of course, 1 year to the day after he had been shot in his front yard, St. Peter's Square. And he'd come on pilgrimage to Fatima to give thanks for his life having been spared that day. So there's the usual stuff at the airport in Lisbon. The president is there, the prime minister is there, they give a speech, the Pope gives a speech. And he went off text that day in simply describing why he was there, and said, speaking of that event, which had happened on the liturgical memorial of Our Lady of Fatima, in the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences. In the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences. What we perceive as coincidence, the Pope gets shot on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, is in fact a facet of what we perceive as coincidence, is simply a facet of the great plan that we haven't figured out how to get into the picture frame quite yet. I mean, the world must have thought it was simply mere coincidence that he would be shot on the day of Our Lady of Fatima. Why did that fall on a Wednesday that year? That's General Audience Day. He didn't think it was coincidence at all. And of course, as he said many times, one hand fired and another guided the bullet. I mean, here's a professional assassin who's as close to the Pope as I am to Tommy, and he doesn't get it. Comes within a millimeter of getting him. The bullet missed his abdominal aorta by a millimeter. Which, that gets hit all game. So there was a lot of providential activity going on that day. But reflecting on that striking statement of his in the Designs of Providence, there are no mere coincidences, helped me to see my own life in a different perspective. And so the first part of this memoir is a memoir of things that happened to me that I couldn't have imagined at the time were leading up to what would become, the pivotal work of my life, but in retrospect seemed to be quite providential. The first of these is in fact my favorite story in the whole book. I take you back to the cathedral school in Baltimore right before Ash Wednesday, 1960. I was in 3rd grade, and as usual, the principal, Sister Mary Euphemia, we had some great names in those days. Sister Mary Euphemia, SSND, gets on the public address system, leads the prayers, the Pledge of Allegiance, and then announces that beginning on Ash Wednesday, which was a few days away, every class in each of the 8 grades in the school was going to pray all during Lent for the conversion of a communist dictator. This is Cold War America, right? So, we're in 3rd grade. The only communist dictator we'd ever heard of was Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet boss who had been pounding his shoe on the table at the UN, which kind of got people's attention. So we all hope, well, let's hope we get Khrushchev for our designated prayee. My Cuban cousins were hoping we would get Castro or something would happen. Anyway, we're hoping we get Khrushchev. So Ash Wednesday comes, we are marched across to the old cathedral in Baltimore, get the ashes, come back, and there Sister Mary Florence is writing the name of our miscreant on the blackboard. It was not Khrushchev. And I don't know what others of my classmates thought, but I seem to vaguely remember thinking, whatever that language is, it needs a few more vowels and a few less consonants. Now, our guy was Władysław Gomułka, the head of the Polish Communist Party. Now, if you had told me in March 1960, all right, beginning in 1992, 32 years from now, you were going to be publishing books in which Władysław Gomułka's complicated role in church-state relations in Poland from the end of the Second World War to the late 1960s, you're going to figure prominently, I would have said, you are crazy. This is not going to happen. You cannot tell me now that that did not plant some sort of a seed in the back of my little 9-year-old head that would flower later in a great interest in Polish history and literature and culture and so forth. There were also my philosophical studies in college. I had no idea when I was slogging, and I do mean slogging, through the essays of Edmund Husserl, the founding father of the philosophical school known as phenomenology, in the fall of 1972. And Edmund Husserl was one of the 3 worst writers in human history. This is absolutely impenetrable stuff. That 20, 25 years later, that would all be of use, as I had to explain what this guy and his way of thinking had meant to a young Polish priest and intellectual who had then become Pope and was applying some of that Husserlian method of thinking about things to the life of his times, and even in papal encyclicals. You really can't understand how John Paul II reads biblical texts, particularly that story of the rich young man at the beginning of the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, without having some sense of how Husserl, this impenetrably awful writer, but very important thinker, had impacted him. So, I mean, there's another thing that only 20 years after it happens, that little bit of intellectual agony comes into focus as preparation. In the mid-1980s, my wife and I had moved back to Washington for 9 years in Seattle. And I was doing some work in the Congress with a friend of mine who was representing the Seattle district. And we created, in the Congress, a bipartisan caucus in defense of the religious freedom of Lithuania, which was then incorporated into the Soviet Union, but the 600th anniversary of its conversion to Christianity was coming up, and I thought it was an important occasion to lift this up, and got everybody from an obscure young Democratic staffer named George Stephanopoulos to a host of other curious characters involved in raising a lot of cane publicly about the persecution of the Catholic Church in Lithuania. That just seemed to be a good thing to do at the time, but again, in this case, less than 10 years later, it was essential preparation for understanding the role of John Paul II in the collapse of communism and his impact not only in Poland, but inside the Soviet Union. The same was true for another project I ran in 1988 called An Appeal for Religious Freedom in the Soviet Union on the millennium of Christianity among the Eastern Slavs. How's that for a brief and succinct title? 1988 was the 1000th anniversary of the baptism of Vladimir and Olga of Kiev. The Russian church was trying to grab all of this. The Soviet government was trying to grab all of this. I decided what we needed to do was actually really put the pressure on for a genuine breakthrough to religious freedom in what was then the Soviet Union. So I organized this quite detailed appeal for religious freedom in the Soviet Union, explaining precisely what that would mean in terms of Soviet law and whatnot. And I got just about every major religious leader in the country to sign that, gave it, presented it to President Reagan in the Oval Office that helped shape his remarks in Moscow a few months later. Again, that just seemed like a good thing to do at the time, and yet, again, it opened up a whole set of ideas and connections for me that would be immensely useful when I came to write the biography of John Paul II. There are multiple other examples of these coincidences that then become clear, are providences in my own life in the book, but I think the lesson out of all of that, that's perhaps for everyone, is one should always, in the Christian life, think vocation, not career. This has been something I've tried to live by for the past 40 years. I have almost never finished a decade doing what I thought I would be doing at the beginning of that decade. And the John Paul II biographies are a perfect example of that. I was very happily running the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington in 1995. I'd been doing that since 1989, expecting to keep doing it for a long time to come. Had a great bunch of colleagues, very generous donors, and we were doing good work. And then came a very bad biography of John Paul II by a guy now deceased named Tad Schultz. And I was asked to review that book, and when I am reading a set of galleys for review, you know, I put an X in the margin every time there's something wrong or a mistake or a kind of dubious interpretation. Well, by the time I got finished with Tad Schultz's biography of John Paul II, you know, the book looked like I had been playing tic-tac-toe with him, and I was X'd because it was just a disaster. And the thought occurred to me, I can do better than this. Popped into my head. In May of that year, my wife and I were marking our 20th wedding anniversary in Rome. She wanted to go to the audience. I had been to a number of papal mob scenes at that point, didn't need to do that again. So she goes to the audience, and I went into the press office to see Joaquin Navarro Valls, John Paul II's Spanish layman press secretary. And I had written this rather brutal review of Schultz, which had been translated into Polish. The Pope had read it, thought I had gotten it right. But I said to Joaquin, look, this is absurd. This guy has been Pope for 17 years. The Great Jubilee is coming. We need a reliable biography of him. So we spent an hour talking about who could do this and do it better. And I said at the end of that, you know, I think I could do this. And he agreed to discuss that with the higher authority. And that discussion went on for some months, and then as this book Lessons in Hope begins, I'm having dinner with the Pope in December of 1995, and he makes it very forcefully clear that he thinks it would be a good idea if I would do this. That transition in my life, which really changed everything, at least from a professional point of view, came from taking seriously an instinct, which I like to think was a spirit-led instinct. But whatever it was, I just, as they say, followed my gut on this and decided I'm going to give up what I'm doing now and do this, and then we'll see what happens after One other facet of John Paul II that I can mention briefly, because it follows immediately after that dinner. I had come back in March 1996 to discuss how we were going to make this work. And over dinner, I said to him, Holy Father, there are two things necessary for this to work. I have to have access to you, to your friends and associates, and the paper that might otherwise be under some sort of time lock. I know I can't have everything, but I have to be the judge of what I need. And the second thing is, you can't see a word of this till I hand you the final book. Now he looked at me across the table and said, well, that's obvious. Let's talk about something else. He believed in the moral responsibility of others. Now, there were a lot of people in the Vatican who were trying to look over my shoulder at every point along the line of this. The only things I checked with Vatican officials involved two ongoing diplomatic negotiations in which there were prisoners of conscience involved, and I didn't want to make difficulties. But nobody saw a syllable of this until I gave the book to the Pope in September 1996. That didn't make a lot of people happy. He was perfectly comfortable. Why? Because he thought, this is my responsibility. And he had spent his whole life teaching the importance of personal moral responsibility, and he wasn't going to back off of that to make sure he got the book that he wanted. So there's another lesson in that, too, I think. The final lesson, perhaps, takes us to his beatification. Or maybe it was the canonization, I can't remember. It might have been the canonization. In any event, whichever event it was, the Wall Street Journal called me and asked for an op-ed page to run, for an op-ed piece to run on the Saturday before the event, whether it was the beatification or canonization. I thought, what more can I possibly say about this? It was the canonization because the second volume came out. I said, look, 2 books, 1,500 pages, 300 pages of footnotes. What else have I got left to say? And then an idea came into my head. What was so singular about this personality was that out of the depth of his faith, out of his conviction that he wasn't in charge of his own life, God was in charge of his life, and his job was to try to tune in to what God had in mind for his life. Had come what I described in that op-ed piece in the journal as a fierce resistance to the tyranny of the possible. The notion that some things are simply the way they are, and you can't do anything about it. The tyranny of the possible, the tyranny of the things are just the way they are, and you can't do anything about them. In October 1978, everyone thought that the post-World War II division of Europe was a permanent feature of the world geopolitical scene, and there wasn't anything you could do about it. He did not believe that, and 11 years later, the wall came down. In October 1978, nobody believed that the Catholic Church had anything of interest, much less consequence, to say to the sexual revolution. He did not believe that. 6 years later, we have the completion of the theology of the body, which even secular people now recognize as one of the great reflections on human love, our embodiments as male and female, the complementarity and fertility built into that has ever been written, and that has completely redone marriage preparation, etc., in the Catholic Church. As I've said before, no one believed in October 1978 that the Catholic Church had any appeal for young people. They live in some different universe. He did not believe that. He believed that the yearnings of the young human heart were exactly the same in the late 20th century as they were in the mid-20th century when he was a university chaplain. And so we get worldviews today. Do not submit to the tyranny of the possible. If you pray it hard enough, you think about it clearly enough, you'll find ways to move things in a more humane direction. That's what happened in Poland in June 1979. In those remarkable 9 days of his first pilgrimage to Poland, which in retrospect were days in which you could actually feel the history of the 20th century pivoting, he did not talk about politics or economics once. Not once. In 52 different addresses, he said to these people he knew so well, you are not who they, the bad guys, say you are. If you reclaim who you really are, as a people of Christian culture, you will somehow find tools of resistance that they cannot match. And that is, of course, exactly what happened, because 13 months later we get the Solidarity movement and a decade of hard struggle, nonviolent struggle. After that, we get the miracle of the revolution of 1989. Don't submit to the tyranny of the possible. We're at a moment in national history, world history, perhaps even church history, where things seem a bit unstuck. We don't need to submit to the tyranny of the possible. We can get on with doing what we know is true and good and right, and out of that will come a change which we cannot even begin to imagine now. So I think that's the final lesson and hope from John Paul II. He knew that some of us are called to martyrdom. And martyrdom takes many forms, one of which is being displayed in Melbourne, Australia, right now. But we should always hold that as a horizon of hope. God has surprises in mind. Don't submit to the tyranny of the possible. It will only make you more upset. Get on with doing the right thing, and you just don't know what's going to happen. Something better may indeed happen out of that. So I hope those are some things that will help focus your Lenten reflection over the next 7 weeks. I did want to mention one other thing with reference to Lent. I suspect everyone here has some sort of smartphone on them. Am I correct in that? Okay, well, now, if you like, you can dial up Amazon.com, and then when it asks you what you're looking for, punch in Roman Pilgrimage. This is a book I wrote 5 years ago with my son as the photographer and the great art historian Elizabeth Lev as the tour guide. And this will be, I think, particularly interesting for those of you who grew up as Anglicans. In the first millennium of Catholic history, the Pope used to lead a procession every day from one church to another every day during Lent. These were called the station churches of Rome. This tradition fell into disarray, but has been revived in the late 20th century by American seminarians in Rome. And this morning, the station church being San Agostino, some 400 Anglophones in Rome, including all of the students in the North American College, many of the students from the English College, Scots College, the Irish College, English-speaking diplomats in Rome, Anglophones in the Roman Curia, went to the station church of the day. There's a special church for each day during Lent to celebrate Mass together, reviving this tradition which actually goes back even before Gregory the Great. your patron was the man who first systematized this and set out the program. You go this day on Ash Wednesday, and you go this place on Thursday after Ash Wednesday. It runs all the way through Easter. So I decided this needed to be captured in a book. Not everybody's going to be able to go to Rome for 2 months and do this. So the book takes you to each of these churches every day, gives you a description of the church, its history, its architecture, its decoration. I have a reflection on the liturgical text of the day, both Mass and the breviary. So it's a great way to do a Roman pilgrimage at home, if I may say so. And I advise you to get the electronic edition. Get the Kindle or electronic edition, put it on your phone or your tablet, because all of the pictures are in color in the electronic edition, and you can tap on them and they zoom out, and you are right inside some of the great architectural treasures of the church. So pardon the little advertisement there, but it is Lent, and a lot of people have found this a very good way to do Lent. And I may say to the clergy present that a lot of priests have found it a great homily source. So I invite you to look up Roman Pilgrimage on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but do get the electronic version. I mean, the book is very handsome, but most of the book pictures are black and white. My son did a fantastic job on the photography of this, and you really get a sense of that from the electronic edition with this zoom function, where you can actually see individual pieces of mosaic in some of these places. So there's another way to do Lent in a different key this year, and I commend that to you. Roman pilgrimage. Are we going to do a little questions now? Is that the idea? Sure. Folks want to ask a few questions, or there's no football on this issue. Yes, sir.
I've read some assertions that when I read them didn't seem to be vicious or crank, but which hold that the Holy Father had been told about priestly abuse and the Lavender Mafia, but that the assertions go he didn't want to hear it, or he was incredulous and didn't pursue it. Do you know anything about
Yeah, I know a lot about that. There's actually a whole chapter in this on the Long Lent of 2002, and my efforts to get some focus on that in Rome. First point, I think, would be, first of all, let's dispose of the mechanic stuff. Anyone who thinks that John Paul II would knowingly appoint a serial sexual predator, the Archbishop of Washington, and a cardinal is on Planet Zongo. I mean, that just was not known at that time. And anyone who says it was simply does not know the facts in the case, which I do. I think there was a predisposition to be skeptical about some of this stuff. Why? Because a classic, both Nazi and communist tactic in attacking the Catholic Church was to paint priests as sexual perverts. A colleague of mine in this program I teach in Krakow every summer, about 10 years ago, found in a used bookstore in Krakow old Nazi comic books that had somehow survived for 60, 70 years. They are full of the most grotesque images of clerical perversion. Communists did the same thing. So, I think it's true that there was an instinct to think, this is an attack on the church. I've been through this before. Secondly, John Paul II was of a generation of priests who so loved the priesthood that I think it was just very, very difficult for them to imagine other priests behaving this way. I mean, I ran into this constantly in the U.S. among bishops in 2002. People who just could not wrap their heads around the idea that these things were going on. As I detail in here, making public for the first time a letter I wrote the Pope in April of 2002, once he got it, he acted. And there was the meeting with the American Cardinals, and there was the statement, there is no place in the church for those who would harm the young. The learning curve was slower than it should have been. But once he got it, he acted on it. In the cases of Maciel and McCarrick, we're talking here about psychopaths who were very clever at fooling people and who fooled a lot of people, and not just fellow priests and bishops. McCarrick was one of the great pickpockets of the Catholic Church of the past 40 years. There are an awful lot of very rich people who got very fooled by him. Maciel the same way. The lesson I take from that is that however good our intake procedures are in seminaries, however good our formational programs are, our continuing education programs are, we need to be attentive to red flags about pathological personalities, which, you know, some competent Catholic psychiatrists and psychologists can help us identify. So I think that's the full complex story of that. The attack on John Paul II in recent months has largely come from people who are trying to defend the less than adequate response of the present pontificate to all of that. And that's not particularly edifying, but that's unfortunately the state of affairs in the church today. Yes, Bob?
I don't know anything about the Australian legal system. As I understand it, Cardinal Pell's appeal will be heard in June.
That's right.
What are the prospects for reversal of that conviction?
Well, they ought to be good because, as I think I've shown in the 3 articles I've written about that, what was alleged to have happened simply could not have happened. You would have to believe that 10 impossible things took place simultaneously within a 7 or 8 minute period for this to happen. The first trial, which ended up in a hung jury, voted 10-2 for acquittal. Second trial, to everyone's astonishment, including the judges, flipped to 12-0 for conviction. The only rational explanation of that is that people's minds have been so poisoned by an atmosphere of anti-Catholicism that is really unimaginable for Americans. It really is Dreyfus. There is a kind of utter irrationality about this, where you take the first bishop in Australia to really get to grips with abuse, and because he's an Orthodox Catholic, and because he doesn't like PC stuff, and he's willing to mix it up on issues, you decide to take him down on those grounds. I mean, there's something pathological about this, and I think it's quite parallel to the attack. You know, we're going to make Dreyfus, the Jew, the scapegoat for the failures of the French military in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War. I mean, the Australian legal system is bizarre beyond belief. They do not have jury challenges the way we do. There was no possibility of the Cardinal requesting a bench trial. I'll waive the jury and put this in the hands of the judge. I think the media suppression order was well intended. I think the judge wanted to try to keep the circus to a minimum, but the net effect of that was that the prosecution did not have to convince the public of this impossible case that they were trying to present, in which, by the way, there was absolutely no corroborating evidence or even any evidence that these acts had taken place. while there were 20 people present on the day saying it's impossible that this could have happened. The analogy would be that Father goes back to the sacristy, and there's nobody else around, and all of you people have disappeared, and in 10 minutes does unspeakable things to the choir boys, who then go to a choir rehearsal and nobody says anything for 25 years. I mean, this is completely crazy. The appeal will be heard on June 5th and 6th. I've actually read the appeal. If the appellate, it's 3 judges, if they believe in, the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt, this is going to be thrown out. Because this is so far beyond a reasonable doubt that it ought to be. But this has never been, in my view, from the beginning, a criminal trial. This has been a political assassination. And you never know what's going to happen under those circumstances. But that's when the appeal is heard. There will be a sentencing next Wednesday, which will be another grim day. And then there will be a motion for bail, which who knows whether that'll be granted or not. So we don't know how long his Lenten retreat will last, as he describes it. But that's the schedule for this right now. And I hope that the fact that this appeal is not going to be heard for 3 months will allow for some rationality to enter into this. There has been a shift in view in parts of Australia. I mean, there are parts of the legal community who are now thinking we're looking really bad, which they are. There are one of the most prominent political commentators in the country, who's an atheist, has said this is a complete outrage. There's no possible way that this was a proper verdict. So there's beginning to be some movement. But if you look at the video of the mob, there's just no other word for it, the mob outside the court, they are baying for blood. And it's a very, I said at the end of this column this past Wednesday, whatever the ultimate resolution of this, the entire Western world, but certainly our friends down under, need to really think hard about how things could have come to this kind of a pass. Brett Kavanaugh was bad enough, but this is Kavanaugh times 20. I experienced some of this the 2 times I've been in Australia. It's a toxic anti-Catholic atmosphere, particularly in Melbourne. And it has to be said, Pell's predecessors, both in Melbourne and Sydney, were way, way, way behind the curve on dealing with this abuse stuff, to put it gently. Now, he immediately instituted, on becoming Archbishop of Melbourne, a very stringent set of protocols for dealing with this stuff. When he got to Sydney, he did the same thing. There were some false charges against him then. He applied his own standards to himself. Stepped aside from office, let a judicial inquiry go forward. He was completely exonerated. He came back. This is not the action of a guilty man. And as I said in a piece a couple of weeks ago, he didn't have to go back to Australia. He's a member of the College of Cardinals and a senior Vatican official, which means as a member of the College of Cardinals, he's a citizen of Vatican City. And as a member of the College of Cardinals, he has a Vatican diplomatic passport. He could have simply sat there and said, this is rubbish, I'm not dealing with this. And perhaps a guilty man might have been tempted to do that. An innocent man does not freely go back into what he knows is a lion's den, because he wants to defend his honor and the honor of the church and all that he had built in 20 years as a bishop there. I think that itself suggests something.
Can the appeal judges hear the appeal on the basis of the substantive charges, or are they restricted to procedural irregularities?
No, it's something. the hope is that, I think I've put this in a couple of these pieces, which you can find online. There is in their legal system something called an unsafe verdict, meaning a verdict that the jury could not have rationally come to, given the evidence presented. And since there is ample indication that in the second trial, the jury ignored the judge's instructions on how to construe evidence, then if there's any, honor, credibility, honesty left, they will declare this an unsafe verdict. Now, the Crown may then decide, okay, we're going to try this a third time. I mean, hopefully they will just, at that point, say, all right, Boston, enough is enough. But I think that's the hope, is that this appellate panel, it's three judges, and the trial judge can make a submission to that appellate panel, and since he's actually been pretty good during this whole thing, I'm hoping, he apparently was stunned by the second verdict. I hope he mans up and does his duty and says, look, this really does not make a lot of sense. They do not have the option that in some states and jurisdictions we have, where the jury can bring back some completely weird verdict and the judge says, thank you for your time, you got it wrong, that's that, and throws the thing out. They do not have that option. It's a very, very strange legal system. Yes, ma'am?
I can't think of anyone I will ever be able to ask a question like this, so I'm going to.
Should I grip the podium?
No, it's just, obviously your opinion, but how do you think Pope St. John Paul II is praying now for the solution or a solution to this current abuse crisis?
Yeah. I think he, well, I don't know. I imagine, I had a very firm talk with him at his tomb 2 weeks ago. I said, come on, a little intercessory power here. Look, this is a man who for 50, 60 years lifted up a heroic view of the priesthood, and for 40 years lifted up a heroic view of the episcopate. If you go online and go to YouTube and put in Bishop Thomas Daly's Spokane abuse crisis, I just watched this video this morning. That's what John Paul II would do. Bishop Daly is a friend. He's a real John Paul II bishop. He is completely candid, completely blunt, talks about this as a necessary moment of purification in the life of the church, so we get on with the new evangelization, promises to do whatever can be done to help victims, talks about the importance of reform, seminary formation, etc. That's a John Paul II take on this, I think. Thomas Daly, D-A-L-Y. The living parts of the church throughout the world are the parts that are still embracing the interpretation of Vatican II given by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The dying parts of the church are the parts that are trying to make Catholic light work, which we now should know after 50 years, Catholic light does not work. Catholic light, indeed, is a factor in this crisis, as I explained 17 years ago in the book, The Courage to be Catholic. So I think those are the things that he would be praying about and thinking about. Courage, fortitude, honesty, a deepened commitment to chastity for everyone. One of the disappointments of the Rome meeting for me was that John Paul II's beautiful phrase to describe chastity, the integrity of love, was never heard. That puts the whole issue of how to deal with human passions in a positive context. The church is not just saying no to stuff for the sake of saying no. The church is saying no to certain things because it's saying yes to the integrity of life. Now, that's not easy for anybody, and it's foolish to pretend that it is. And we all need to pray for a deepening of that virtue in all of our lives. But that's what we ought to be lifting up. We're about the integrity of love. We're about beatitude. We're about human happiness. And these are the things we think make for that on the basis of 2,000 years of experience, not to mention divine revelation and human reason. So I think that's the way this needs to be framed. And it's not just about kids. That's the other thing. This is not just about the betrayal of vows with vulnerable young people. It's about any betrayal of vows. The vows of ordination, the vows of marriage. We all need to help each other live the integrity of love. And that in this tsunami of smut that we find ourselves in, that requires help. It requires, other people around you who are trying to live the same way and who lift you up when you fall and all the rest of it. So thanks for raising that. Those are some things that come to mind there.
What do you think that the American bishops will do at their meeting in June to further procedures to control abuse and cover?
They're going to do what they were going to do in November and got stopped from doing by what I have called on numerous occasions an inappropriate Vatican intervention. The green light has now been given to proceed with a code of conduct for bishops with mechanisms involving lay participation for assessing allegations of misconduct, malfeasance, whatever, by bishops. So I think what should have happened last November is going to happen in June. That's certainly the commitment of Cardinal DiNardo, the president of the conference. Yes?
You talk about the theology body, you went so some years ago about being a theological time body. Think about this century now. How long do we have to wait? In America, it's too obvious what is great. I mean, we have organizations now teaching that you go online and it's built in. They're making it super easy. Nobody's used classes and that.
Actually, that is the one phrase I wish I had never written in Witness to Hope. The theology of the body is a time bomb to go off in the 21st century. Because I think very few people have grasped what I meant by that. What I meant by that is that this was going to re-sacramentalize all of Catholic theology, not just moral theology. But this notion of our embodiedness being revelatory of divine truth was going to get us out of this Gnostic world of imagination, what Newman would call shadows and images, and into the truth. Now, I think the theology of the body has had a tremendous impact already. You cannot go to a Catholic campus, or indeed a state university campus, without finding a theology of the body reading group. They're everywhere. And they're usually organized by students. This has transformed marriage preparation in dioceses that, have their game face on. And that's terribly important. There are an enormous number of academic, doctoral dissertations and whatnot being written on all of this, which bodes well for intellectual life down the line. Look, we're the Oakland A's against the New York Yankees. But you know, the A's won a lot of games last year. You know, we gotta be smart in the way we deploy the resources we have, which are not what, you know, the other side has. But I don't know anyone who's encountered this body of thought that has not been moved profoundly by it. And I think it has, there were, what, 14 or 16 major conferences around the country last summer with anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people at each one, celebrating Humane Vitae. That was inconceivable 30 years ago. And every single one of them was built around the theology. So, I don't mean to underestimate the challenge. No American teenager can walk through a mall today and not be assaulted by counter-Christian signals. Another good reason not to walk through malls. But we do have instruments now that I think have been proven effective, and that we simply didn't have 30 years, much less 50 years ago. So the other thing I would say is that at a certain point, the sum total of human misery that has been caused by all of this nonsense for the past 50 or 60 years is going to become so oppressive that people are going to want to look at it. And we have to be ready with an open hand to help them take that second look. I cannot believe that this transgender nonsense is going to last indefinitely. It is destructive in an extraordinary way, and that is going to rebound. There's a sense in which the truly perverse late-term abortion laws that are being done all over the country are finally facing the country, making the country, what are we talking about? That we're talking about killing children. That's what we're talking about. So if we encourage our public officials to talk honestly about what are we talking about, I am not a great fan of Cardinal Coney, formerly of Los Angeles, but he did have a very good riposte to pro-choice people. He would say, finish the sentence. Choose what?